Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave room for the wrath of God. For it is written, vengeance is mine, says God, I will repay. No. Oh. If your enemies are hungry, label them and marginalize them. If your enemies are hungry, call them liberals. Or conservatives. Or fundamentalists. If your enemies are hungry, be close enough to them to know when they're hungry, and then feed them. If they're thirsty, make sure they know that they're wrong, and then, it's not what it says. It says, give them something to drink. For by doing this, you will heap burning coals on their heads. Oh, that sounds good. Now, that sounds good. Here we go. Burning coals on the scalps of my enemies. You can make a movie about that. Here's the problem. Here's what we think this might mean. There's a very involved word picture here. Cities, especially big cities, typically had walls. And the folks making the most would actually live inside the walls. They would rent a nice apartment inside of the city with walls. The poor folks, though, typically would be found in tent cities outside of the walls. And so you had this whole population of poor folks outside of the walls. Now, even amongst this tent city, amongst the people who would live in this tent city, there were better pieces of real estate than others. Sometimes, when it was particularly cold, the city might do the poor folks the favor of digging a hole and creating a fire pit. And sometimes it was just the poor folks themselves who would dig a hole and create this fire pit. And this fire pit would just burn all the time. And they would keep heaping wood. Sometimes it actually put rocks down into this fire pit just to make them really, really hot. The best piece of property was the piece of property nearest to the fire pit, especially when it was really cold. If you could somehow have your tent right there next to the fire pit, then you could immediately take the tongs or whatever you would have, and you could put the hot rock or the hot coal into your bucket there, let's say your clay jar, and you could take it back to your house, and it would stay hot enough that once you got it inside of your tent, it would warm your entire household. The problem is those spots filled up pretty quickly, and sometimes there were so many people in a tent city that some people, even though the fire pit was way over there, some people had to live a long way away, so far away that by the time they got their hot rock or their burning coal all the way home, it wasn't hot anymore. So sometimes what people would do, sometimes what good, gracious people would do, recognizing that I lived so far away from the fire pit over there, recognizing that by the time I got all the way back over here that my little coal was not going to be able to warm my entire family, sometimes what good people would do is they would actually share some of their hot coals. Now, a lot of times these coals were carried in jars, and sometimes those jars would be carried on someone's head. And so sometimes what would happen is people would take the jar and they'd put it on their head and they would make the long trek back home. And other people, recognizing how far they had to walk, might take some of their own coals and they would heap it on top of this person's head. They would put some of their own coals, still hot, into this clay jar because that newly added coal would actually warm everything back up. So to heap burning coals on someone's head would be to have this gesture, to make a gesture of kindness that would not just warm that person, but perhaps by the time they got all the way back to their tent that's all the way over here, a long way away from the fire pit over there, to heap burning coals on someone's head might make a difference not just for that person, but might actually warm an entire household. So sorry, if you wanted to see your enemy's scalps burned clean off, sorry. What Paul is saying here is this. When you feed your enemy because he's hungry, when you give your enemy something to drink because she's thirsty, then there's a possibility that you not only make a difference in that person's life, but who knows? You might make a difference in an entire household.